I've read several books by Kerry Wilkinson at this point, and they've all been really lovely, really gripping. I've read 3 consecutively, and I basically never do that with authors. But The Child Across the Street is a bit of a weak link. It was enjoyable enough. I read it through to the end and I was interested in knowing what the outcome was. Unfortunately, and this never happens with me, but I actually worked out who was responsible for what was happening. Basically, when that character was first introduced, just straight away I could tell there was something about this character, and I knew, well, I suspected, of course, that it was them. And I was right, and I'm never right about it, so I don't know what that really says. But to make a long story short, this centres around Abby, and she goes back to the village where she used to live as a child, teenager, because her father has passed away. She didn't have a very close relationship with him. We do find out bits about their volatile relationship as the narrative progresses, and it's interesting enough. It feels like fluff because it doesn't really add much to who she is as a person within the context of this narrative. It doesn't really give her any motivation for what she's trying to do or anything, because she actually stumbles upon a hit and run. A young child who is 8 years old is hit by a car and basically almost left for dead. If she wasn't there at the time to call an ambulance straight away, he probably would have died immediately there and then. And for the majority of the novel, it's not certain whether or not he's going to pull through, or if there are going to be, any long-term complications or anything like that. But that's not really what it's about. It's all about trying to find out who was driving the car in the hit and run. And as I said, I worked it out really quickly, and I never ever do. So I'm not really sure what that says. But obviously, because I wasn't 100% certain that that's who it was, I was obviously still engaged with the novel and the narrative and wanted to keep reading to find out who it was. The reason that this is not really a well-written book is that the repetition is tedious, but then also it just stops. For example, for maybe the first half of the book, maybe the first 2/3, Abby takes a sip from her bottle every second sentence. Now, that's obviously an exaggeration, but the same thing is kind of repeated in the phrase, something like, the cash I took from my father's house, because there was money left at her father's house after he passed away. That sentence is used a lot, and there's just a lot of repetition of small phrases and things, and when you're reading this in a couple of sittings, it's obviously still fresh in your mind, and that's all still there. And then a character was brought in, and I can't really say who this character is without spoiling anything, but the character was brought in. I'm trying to find a way to explain it without giving anything away. The character was brought in, let's say, in the final third of the novel, and this character added nothing at all. This character maybe played a slightly important role in the outcome of the novel, but any other character who had been introduced to could have played that. And in fact, I can think of a few people who could have played that role instead and could have been important in that way, because there are quite a few characters who just drift away. They have their own little narratives going on, and then they just kind of stop being mentioned towards the climax of the book. And there are so many loose ends and so many things that are not tied up, that the narrative, although it kept me curious, there are a lot of things about it that just didn't reach a conclusion, that didn't need to be there, that didn't need to be said 7,000 times. Abby as a character is relatively well developed. I don't know enough about her as a person to understand anything, really. I don't know really what she was doing with her life before the beginning of this novel. I do know a bit about her teenage years, because that's explained, but the gap in between, not so much. Is it important to the narrative? Well, in a sense, no, but at the same time, it could have given her a bit more motivation for why she was hanging around to find out who did this hit and run. there was no real reason for why she was hanging around, except maybe you could argue that she wasn't actually ready to fully let go of the past. Maybe. So would I recommend it? I mean, yeah, I would, because even though it turned out to be predictable, while reading it I didn't know that. And it's not, in terms of the development of the narrative, it's pretty interesting. And there are certain characters as well. Joe as a character behaves weirdly in certain situations, and there's no real explanation for it. It's like there's a lot of setting things, a lot of setting things up, but never really executing any of these. So I'm kind of in two minds about whether or not I think the narrative was well developed. It was well developed in some ways, and there were a few things that I thought were really clever that I hadn't expected. One involving the young boy's brother. I really liked that, and I thought I didn't see that coming, and that was really good. But in terms of the technical aspects, technical quality of the writing, it's not great. There is a lot of repetition. There are a lot of loose ends. Bringing in that character in the final third without any real purpose wasn't really that great. It would have been a good idea if there'd maybe been a sequel to this. I mean, I say that for all I know there maybe is a sequel, but it didn't end as if it needed a sequel. The Child Across the Street's not a bad story at all, but there are so many things in this that just get abandoned and forgotten about, maybe after the first 2/3. The pacing is actually alright. I really like the pacing, but it's not as good as the other two I read. And it hasn't put me off the author either. I'm actually about to go and immediately download another of Kerry Wilkinson's books from Amazon. So it hasn't put me off at all. It's interesting enough. If you like psychological thrillers or mysteries, this kind of thing I think you'll find entertaining enough. It's a very easy read. Once you get past the frustration of the repetition, it's fine. Not the best, and don't start with this one if you've not read any of Wilkinson's books before. But if you have read some of the others, then I'd say give this one a go. There's probably something in there that you'll find quite gripping.